Today I'm driving up to the northern end of Norway. It's my first time abroad for years and years. I've climbed a lot in my own country, in Scotland. I have been to England and Wales in the past 6 or 7 years, but I haven't taken any flights. I pretty much stopped flying for environmental reasons. I haven't taken a flight for, I don't know how many years, 2018 maybe, 2016 I took my last flight. But I do still drive in my own country, and so I thought, well, I could still drive to other countries because it's something that I really miss, travelling to go climbing to different countries. But I couldn't really justify burning the carbon to drive a car all the way to a different country if I was going to not fly to not burn that carbon. So I've actually waited for several years. For the last 5 years or so, I've been saving up to buy an electric car, which I've just done. I'm driving a Tesla Model Y, which I bought earlier this spring. I also watched the price of electric cars come down for many years, especially in the past year. So in this episode, I'd just like to say what it's like driving an electric car in the Highlands of Scotland, driving around quite long distances to go climbing on a daily basis, and also what it's been like road tripping up to the Arctic Circle all the way from Scotland. And I'll just start off with a general conclusion, which is that it's been absolutely brilliant. It's been a lot better actually than I thought it would be. And like many electric car drivers, having driven an electric car for the best part of 6 months, I wouldn't go back. So first of all, a little bit more detail about why I've actually made this change. And it's because I'm concerned about climate change. I do think that we need to try to remove fossil fuels from our life as much as possible. And so for the last 20 years, I've been watching how the world, how society is dealing with the problem of climate change, the threat of it, and the need to transition away from fossil fuels. And we've done a really, really poor job. Globally, fossil fuel use, coal use, oil use is still increasing. It needs to get all the way to zero in order to stop the climate warming, but it's not even started to decrease. So nothing of substance is really happening on a global level. Of course, you can always frame data in many different ways, and if you look in a more granular way at data around the world, such as the EU is reducing its fossil fuel dependence. So in some places around the world, fossil fuel use is going down, but even in those places, it's not going down nearly as fast as we needed to. So over the past 20 years, I've been kind of watching this strategy play out, like what is going to fuel the change, if you will. And we've had several kind of different movements. First is like, you know, there's this threat and politicians need to listen, they need to act, and then they don't act. And then there's the kind of shaming approach that people like Greta Thunberg have taken, where they try and more aggressively shame both politicians and business leaders into changing practices, and that has roundly failed as well. So I really feel that the climate movement needs to go back to square one and have a different strategy. A lot of the discourse in recent years has focused on the idea that individuals, you and I, can't really provide the change at scale. It needs to be government and policy and business that needs to take responsibility and change the system that we exist in. And I think it makes sense, but I just don't think it's really working that well. So I kind of wonder if actually individuals do play a larger role than they think they do. I don't know that for sure. I don't know if people taking actions like saying, I stopped flying for climate change, I stopped driving a petrol car, I changed the way that I heat my house, I insulated my house, all these different actions that individuals can take, whether that starts to spread as an influence. But the strategies that we have in place at the moment aren't working, so I feel like it's important that we do try. And just on a personal level, although I greatly miss travelling by flight, and it's wonderful to actually be up here in Norway and seeing all these mountains that hopefully I'll get to climb if the rain stays off. That's really good, and I've missed that so much. I don't need to do it. There are some things that are more important than my need to fly, and so it's been difficult to justify. I'm not saying that I would never take a flight ever again, but I've kind of had this decision tree where I think, can I justify this individual trip or flight? And I've always thought kind of no. I live in a country that has quite a lot of rocks, and I have to fly over those rocks to get to some other rocks just to enjoy myself. I don't know if I can justify that really. So I've been trying to personally take those things out of my life. But here we are now. I'm up in the north of Norway. It really feels like a real privilege to be driving here right now. So that brings us to electric vehicles. There's two main problems with them. The first, the biggest one, is that they're really expensive. My car has consistently been the second biggest thing that I've ever bought in my life, second to my house, and I can't afford just to change it on a whim. So I've kind of been waiting for electric vehicles to drop in price for many years, at the same time as saving for them, in part using the money that I've saved from not travelling for several years. And you know, I made progress with that. It took a long time, but I got there. And also in the past year, the price of EVs, especially used EVs, has dropped massively. So this Tesla Model Y that I'm driving, I was looking at these cars for a long time, but they were way out of my price range. You know, this about a year and a half ago might have cost me north of 50 grand. This is a long range version of this car. And I got this car for 35 grand, having just done a few thousand miles. So there's been a big steep drop, and so I thought this is really the time to go for it. So I bought this car back in the early spring, and I've been driving it ever since. We're now at the tail end of the summer, and it's been absolutely brilliant. It's been this EVs and this car specifically has been the best car that I've ever driven by a mile. It's really good. Like everyone else, I was unsure how it would be driving an electric car. Would I be anxious about the range the whole time? You know, if I would need to drive from Fort William to Glasgow, Fort William to Arrochar, Fort William to Torridon or Skye or Cairngorms and back in a day, would I be able to do that? Would I be on the last of my range? You know, a lot of the time on the roads where I live are closed at night for one reason or another, either accidents or roadworks or whatever, and there's no other road. You have to do a detour which is over 100 miles, you know, sometimes 150 miles. And so if you base your journey on the range you've got, and then all of a sudden the road's closed, then you need to do a big detour around a quiet mountain area with no chargers, that could be a problem. So all these things were like, how will that impact my day-to-day working life as a climber? But it's been absolutely fine. The range on this car will drive you 300 miles. You know, its quoted range is 330, but it's going to be just south of 300 miles in the real world. I've never driven at 300 miles in one go. There's just no need to. I don't ever really drive 300 miles without stopping for a pee or a drink of tea. So I've just stopped and charged, and it's been absolutely fine. There's not been one time where I've thought, oh, this is a problem. Where am I going to charge? Where am I going to stop? I just plan it out, and the whole system is well integrated, especially with the Tesla cars. Like they are good. So you just plan your journey, takes you 2 seconds, and the planning aspect people might think of as being a pain in the ass. You can't just get in the car and go and make your plan as you go along, and you know there'll be a petrol station, so you just stop. But the planning aspect actually makes things better. You kind of know where you are, you know what you're going to do, and I've found that it's given me a more relaxed attitude to travelling. Some boulders, trying to drive off the road. Always have one eye on the boulders. So I've driven this car all over the UK, gone down to the Peak District, gone down to Wales, and it's been easy. I spent the summer going to the crags at Arrochar a lot, a 2-hour drive from my house. I've actually stopped and done free charging. There's some free chargers around, some quite good ones as well. So I've driven most of the journey down, stopped and charged for free while I drink some tea and do a little bit of work on my laptop, and then charged up for free the journey that I've just made. It's like almost too good to be true. So I charge the car right back up, go climbing, then drive home, and the car's only like at 70% or something like that. And now I've driven to Norway, so that's a journey that's taken me many days. I also tied it in with a family holiday first, going across Europe and things. So I've driven a long way through lots of different countries, and I mean, it's especially with the Tesla charging, it just could not be easier. There's way more than you need. If a big transition to electric vehicles did happen, then that might get more complicated. So right now you might have a bank of chargers that has 15, 20, 40 chargers, but what if there was 40 cars all needing to charge up? Then that could be a bit of a problem, but that's not the case at the moment. So as I say, yesterday I drove most of the length of Norway from Oslo all the way up into the Arctic Circle, and I think I had about a 15-hour day, 16-hour day, with about 12, 13 hours of actual driving time. So what I did was I stopped every hour and a half to 2 hours, which is when I needed to stop for a pee, and I needed to stop for some more tea. And I would go to the toilet, get some tea, come back, start drinking my tea, and then it would be already charged, and it was time to go and move on. And the car just drives so nicely. It's so good and so easy to drive that driving for hours and hours feels significantly easier to me than it did in my petrol car. And I drove a nice car. I had a Ford S-Max, like kind of top spec, and it was a good car. It is a good car. I still like it, but I have to say the Tesla is another level. It's a brilliant car. I'm way into a tunnel, so we'll see you on the other side. I'm just on my way back down through Sweden just now. It's beautiful here with all the lovely birch forests in the background there. And that's one of the things that people have asked me. Is it really necessary to stop flying? Why not just offset your flights with planting trees? You know, that's often the way that offsetting is sold, in the form of trees or forests planted. But the fundamental problem with that is it just doesn't really work very well at all. Trees, when they're planted on land which is being used for other purposes, often releases a lot of carbon from the soil. You know, soil is one of the biggest sinks of carbon, and that's dependent on the local conditions, so it varies from place to place. Trees are great, they do store carbon, but they're quite vulnerable in the way they store carbon. Sometimes trees are planted and they then die. Sometimes they're just cut down again. And the other major thing that happens to trees is that they burn, and then all of that carbon that you burned in the form of oil and then stored in trees is just lost to the atmosphere again. And at that point we haven't won the game. We still have the climate change. So trees, great as they are a poor substitute for just not burning the oil in the first place, and there's not really any way around that. So that's my broad strategy, just to reduce the amount of burning I do where I can. With the exception of this trip to Norway, I do 99% of the charging that I do at home, which comes from renewable electricity. And with my last car, my last petrol car, I drove it for the bulk of its life to make the most of the baked-in production cost that comes with actually making the car. And then when I needed a new car, I bought a used EV. In a way, I feel quite awkward about making this video because I realised that EVs, and this EV in particular, is still way out of the price range of most people, which is a shame. I couldn't afford to drive a car until my 30s. I got my driving licence when I was 28, and I was gifted my first car by a friend. And before that, I went all over Scotland climbing on public transport, on buses and trains, and hitching, and obviously getting lifts from other friends who had cars. But when I did have the capability to make an active choice to buy and use a car, then I did. And now that I've got the capability to buy and use an EV, then I've done that too, just to minimise my impact. But I did that when I was ready. It was something that I feel it's important for me, because I live in a rural area, to actually drive a car. And so I wanted to make that an EV. That required several years of saving, and so that was my choice. So the point of this video is not to make any inference about what people should or shouldn't do. The point of it is just to say that if you're thinking about driving an EV, but you're worried about the practicality of it, especially for driving in the mountains, then don't be, because it's absolutely fine. In fact, it's much better than driving a petrol car, in my opinion. But more importantly, I also think it's important to share that it's great not flying. You know, I'm here in Norway, having had a brilliant trip, done a brilliant new route on a lovely mountain. And if you know, I started uploading videos to YouTube on a regular basis about 5 years ago. And if you look back through my channel, try to find the deprivation in it. You know, all of the climbing that I've done has been in Scotland, with occasional trips to England and Wales over the past 5 years. And I've had an absolutely brilliant time. You know, my lifestyle is incredibly privileged and I climb in some fantastic places. So whatever the story of a transition to EVs is instead of flying, it's not one of deprivation. Yes, I miss Patagonia and I would love to go back to Sierra. I'd love to hop on a flight to go and try Bon Voyage. But we're talking about the difference between climbing some brilliant rocks or some other brilliant rocks. I know that many of you watching this won't live next to great climbing as I do in the Scottish Highlands, but you're still concerned about burning fossil fuels. And I know of only one way to square that circle, which is to move near the climbing. People will have all sorts of reasons to not make that choice, obviously, but for me, that's been only upsides. So I'm back in Scotland now. I drove home from Arctic Norway without any bother at all. Just a couple more thoughts about electric cars. Based on your comments on my earlier video that I made about the climbing that I did in Norway, are these things really cheaper and more climate friendly to run? Well, obviously it depends a lot on where and how you charge them. Charging them at home makes a massive difference. It's like 10 times cheaper. So I switched my electricity meter to a smart meter. I had to wait 4 months and I had to put pressure publicly on my electricity supplier on their social media channels to actually get them to come and fit the thing. But once it was in, I could access a variable electricity tariff. So all the electricity that I use comes from renewable sources, and the cost of that electricity is about 4 times cheaper overnight from 11:30 in the evening to 5:30 in the morning compared to daytime home electricity. So I plug the car in and it starts charging at 11:30 in the evening. It's scheduled to do that, I don't have to do anything. And charging the whole battery from 0% to 100% would cost about £5.25, and that would get me 300 miles of driving. So, I mean, I think that's pretty damn good. I used to put 70 or 80 pounds worth of petrol in my old car all the time, and that really added up, and I've really noticed all of that money not going out of my bank account every month. Of course, I never actually have to charge the whole battery like that, you know, the whole thing from 0 to 100%. So in reality, if I go climbing a couple of hours away and then drive back again, I'm paying like £3.50, £4 maximum. So for someone who drives quite long distances to climb all the time, as you can imagine, that saving starts to compound into quite a large amount of money over time. So the EV is not just a little bit cheaper to run, it's way, way cheaper. The only complaints that I have are that the handles are a bit of a pain to open when you're carrying tea in one hand, and a couple more buttons on the dashboard would be quite nice. But other than that, it's absolutely brilliant, and I couldn't imagine buying a petrol car again. A couple of folk were worried about battery fires in EVs. So battery fires in EVs, when they do happen, are really not good. But as far as I could gather from the industry and fire service research, fires in EVs are somewhere between 20 and 100 times less likely in EVs than they are in fossil fueled cars. So an EV is a massive reduction in fire risk if you're coming from a fossil car. A couple of folk were worried about the tyre and brake dust from EVs because they're a bit heavier because of the batteries. And yet these are pollutants from vehicles, and it would be good to have a solution to them for all cars. But I'm not sure whether it would be worse with EVs. So considering the brakes first, you don't use brakes to stop in EVs. I mean, you can if you want, but I don't, and I think many people don't. You use regen. So you run the motor in reverse and you just drive with one pedal, and the energy that's usually lost to heat when you're wearing down a brake pad in a fossil fueled car is used to charge the battery back up instead. So you're only using one pedal, and I would maybe touch the brake like a couple of times in a 2-hour drive. With the tyre dust, the EV is a little bit heavier since the batteries are heavy, but for a fossil fueled car, you need an army of massive fuel trucks to drive your petrol around everywhere so that it's there for you to fill up. And fuel trucks are obviously very heavy, and I imagine that they probably shed a lot of brake dust. So this is often the kind of character of argument that you see online put forward by folk that think that climate change doesn't matter or they have some issue with electric cars. They'll often just present a kind of incomplete picture of the trade-offs between fossil fuels and electric cars, or they'll just ignore the comparator altogether. The classic one is the argument about minerals that go into making the battery. So to make an EV battery, you've got to dig up X amount of rock to mine the minerals for the battery. So far, so good. If the choice that we were discussing was drive an EV versus not drive a car at all, then that would be the end of the argument, no problem. But if the argument is drive an EV or drive a fossil fuel car, then we've got to make a comparison. So for the EV, we do that mining once, and then we drive the car for several 100,000 miles. There's some Teslas going around that have driven 500,000 miles with the battery still working just fine. You know, loses like 10-20% of the range in hundreds of thousands of miles, but keeps going. But with the fossil fuel car, we're digging up huge amounts of oil from deep in the ground every single time we drive it. So we're digging up 15 billion tonnes of oil every year, and then we're dumping all of the carbon that we've burned in the atmosphere. That's much worse. So if you're going to drive a car and the environmental impact is important to you, then as far as I can see, EVs are a clear win, and it's not even close. So overall, I'm really glad that I got an electric car. Environmental issues aside, they're just way better. See you in the next episode.